From Social Prosperity Partners, this is Community Catalysts. Welcome to Community Catalysts, the podcast that examines the qualities of community leadership and the many paths and forms it can take. I'm your host, Matt Lehrman. In his 1953 book, The Future of Architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright writes, "Democracy is the highest form of freedom, the democratic idea, the highest form the individual can live. So too with architecture. Organic architecture is the highest form in which the individual may be realized, in which all his activities may be realized as beautiful, significant." To discuss the connection between architecture and democracy and the ongoing responsibility to champion the legacy of the person the American Institute of Architects named the greatest American architect of all time, I'm honored to be joined today by Stuart Graff, President and CEO of the nonprofit Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, which, by the way, is headquartered at Frank Lloyd Wright's winter home at Taliesin West, here in my hometown of Scottsdale, Arizona. Welcome, Stuart. I am really excited to talk to you today.
Nice to be with you, Matt. Always a pleasure to talk with you.
So, Stuart, let's begin by talking about the mission of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, which is to inspire people to discover and embrace an architecture for better living through meaningful connections to nature, the arts, and each other. Stuart, what strikes me is that this is very much a forward-focused mission. It's not about preserving papers or operating a historic site or keeping old memory alive. How do you describe the real work of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It really is about the future, as Frank Lloyd Wright's entire career was. So many historic sites, and we steward two of them, Taliesin in Wisconsin, Taliesin West in Arizona. So many historic sites celebrate the fact that something important happened there. And at times you wonder whether the people in charge of those sites are actually looking over mausoleums, because they're bound and determined to make sure nothing important will ever happen at those sites again. But when Wright created his foundation, the whole point of it was to perpetuate his ideas, which are timeless by definition, timeless ideas about how to build and live better. Organic architecture, the theory of architecture that he creates, is really all about meeting the contemporary moment, how to respond to the needs of the people that inhabit buildings, how to make use of materials and structures and technology and social change that's occurring today and will occur in the future, and how to gather all of that into the design of a building, a room, a community. All of that's central to Wright's whole idea about architecture. And therefore, if it's a meeting of the moment, it can't be locked in the past. Otherwise, it never meets the moment, the contemporary moment, and it certainly can't prepare us for the future. But for a man who spends almost 8 decades in his career working to create a better future and sets up a foundation to outlive him so that those ideas continue to have currency, we can't live in the past. We've got to be about meeting today's moment, today's needs, and preparing ourselves and preparing the world around us, the community around us, to meet the challenges of tomorrow.
Stuart, that's interesting. I did not realize Frank Lloyd Wright himself was responsible for creating the foundation as an enduring way to advance his principles?
Yes, he created the foundation in 1940, originally up in Wisconsin, and he bequeathed to it both during his lifetime and at the time of his death his assets, his intellectual property. He wants the foundation to perpetuate the training of architects and artists in collateral spaces with his ideas. And so it was intended precisely to not only outlive him, but to meet an evolving society and to address the needs of an evolving society. Because nothing's locked in place. If you think about the source of the Wright's inspiration, so much of it comes from nature, and nature is constantly changing, whether it's things that we face today like climate change or just something as simple as the weather. Nature is always meeting the circumstances around it. A tree that suddenly faces, a wind from a certain direction may change its growth pattern. Things that may do well in a stream bed may, as that stream changes course, find themselves dying off and something else growing in its place. So too should an architecture evolve to respond to the needs of the inhabitants of buildings and the society in which its work is done.
I want to just compare the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation with the idea of a presidential library. Just a couple of months ago, I was in Boston and I went to the JFK Presidential Library. And it was a beautiful building, and they preserve papers and they tell the stories obviously of the very short Kennedy presidency. What's going on at Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation is a very different type of focus. You're not just preserving a legacy, you're actually advancing a philosophy.
Indeed. That's why our tagline is advancing the way we build and live. It's because it is not about the past. The past gives us, if you will, roots. We understand where these ideas come from, how Wright evolved these ideas in his time. But that can't be the end of the story.
Stuart, when you think about how you go about applying scarce time and resources to advancing this, do you think about who the targets are that you most want to influence? Does the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation exist to influence architects or students or policymakers, or is it the public at large? Give us a sense of how you view the target audience for the work that you do.
Yeah, the very short answer is yes. It's all of those things. We have public programming. That's for the general public, whether it's the local resident or the tourist visitor to Scottsdale, or the members of the agricultural community around our Wisconsin property in Spring Green. Change happens one person at a time. That's a cliche, but it also happens to be very true. And so if that's the difference we make, that's great. But at the same time, I can bring a group of legislators, or I can bring a group of other policy leaders. And we just did this recently on the subject of affordable housing, something that Wright was concerned with throughout his very long career. And say, we've been talking about this for at least 100 years, because I have writings by Frank Lloyd Wright that are more than 100 years old, addressing questions about affordable housing. So let's bring thought leaders together in a room. Let's bring policymakers in a room with them and see how we can stop talking and writing about affordable housing and start taking action. And I think cultural institutions have a very strong reason to do that, namely because we're among the most trusted institutions, maybe one of the few trusted institutions or groups of trusted institutions that are left in American society. People respect us as being neutral arbiters, that we hold facts and artifacts. We hold history, and we try to present it as often as possible without an agenda, so that people can make up their own minds as we see the opportunities to impact the world around us. And it's not a fixed formula. It is a way to endlessly layer on the ability to change the world around us for the better. So the visitor who comes in for a tour hears something that's been created by a thought leader from our academic space, the Taliesin Institute, and that in turn responded to something that came out of our policy discussion. So it all layers up together. In other words, these aren't disjunctive parts. If we're doing this well, all of this work, whether it's at the very high intellectual or policymaking level, or the level for mainstream consumption, all of it's very integrative in nature.
Stuart, let's talk about you for a moment. You've been the president and CEO of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation since 2016?
Yep, I think I am the longest serving CEO at the foundation since Olga Vanna Wright died in the mid-'80s.
That was Frank Lloyd Wright's daughter.
Frank Lloyd Wright's wife.
Oh, wife, excuse me. So you're not an architect. You're actually an attorney by training. So talk a bit about how you came to this position. How did you become the champion of Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy?
As a kid, I was enrolled in an unusual program that the Chicago Public Schools had for what I would call non-traditional learners, kids who were more likely to learn things through self-direction than having a structure in a classroom. And that meant we were always going out, whether it was learning physics at Fermilab or Argonne National Laboratory, or learning manufacturing in a nearby auto factory or a pottery factory, or going out to a farm or going to museums. We were always going out into the world and having experiences and then building projects around experience to reflect our learning from that experience. And very early on, I saw there were things to be exposed to in the world that weren't going to come to me through a traditional school environment or through my family. The world was a much bigger place than either the family structure or the traditional school structure allowed. And I was curious about all of them. And one of those things that I learned about was Frank Lloyd Wright, because in the early 70s in Chicago, after several important historic buildings had been demolished, there developed a very active historic preservation community. And from there, we began to have tours of Chicago architecture offered through what's now the Chicago Architecture Center. And it was on one of those school field trips with a tour of downtown Chicago architecture that I saw my first Frank Lloyd Wright work. And so I went out and the library when I got home, and I got every book about Frank Lloyd Wright I could find and learned a lot about architecture. But as much as I was interested in Frank Lloyd Wright's work and in the work of architecture, I found his life story fascinating. He is the quintessential American. He is a farm kid, rural Wisconsin. He figures out that he has an interest and some talent to draw when he works with an established architect on the family chapel and the property in Iowa County, Wisconsin. He goes off to the big city, dropping out of high school and 1 year of engineering school at UW. He drops out, goes to the big city, goes to work with this architect, becomes an apprentice, later apprentices with Louis Sullivan, who is the father of the modern skyscraper and so much of American architecture, and then strikes out on his own. And this farm boy who figures out his talent, works his butt off, when he goes to the city, goes on to revolutionize the world of architecture. And that's reflected in the fact that in 2019, his work was added to the World Heritage List by UNESCO, which means that the cultural leaders from around the globe recognize that Wright's work, embodied in 8 particular buildings, but really it's the entire body of work that winds up on the list, that this work revolutionized the way we live throughout the world, revolutionized architecture. And well, for a young working class kid from the northwest side of Chicago, that story of the farm boy goes to the city, finds his talent and makes good, that inspired me to believing that I could make a difference in the world too. So I go to engineering school because that's as close to architecture as I'm going to get. Don't want to practice engineering, go to law school. But at the same time, I'm also, while I'm doing those things professionally, I'm also deeply engaged in the arts and in the cultural scene. Not only as an audience member, but serving on boards, working with individual artists, as a lawyer to help protect and sell their works. And I've always had that interest. Well, after a few decades of doing that work as a lawyer and then running global businesses, I'd achieved my goals, and it was really time to start giving back to the community.
It seems like there was a lot in your youth, a lot in your career experience that prepared you to be able to take on this position. I want to ask you the reverse side of that then. What is something that you had to learn on the job, something that all your prior experience did not prepare you for running an organization like this?
Yeah, I'd say there's probably a couple of key things that I would point out. First, I had no background in historic preservation other than as someone who enthusiastically supported supports historic preservation. Knew nothing about the different approaches. It was all on the job training, and thankfully, our vice president for preservation, Fred Prezillo, has been a masterful educator teaching me about that over the 8.5 years that I've been here. The other thing that I think I didn't fully understand, I think I had a glimpse of it, didn't fully understand, is just how hard it is to do this work of taking a cultural legacy and bringing it to life for an audience. I've been the beneficiary of that many times as a museum goer, as someone who visits historic sites. And thankfully, as an audience member, most of the places I visited have made it look very easy. I hope we make it look very easy. But there's a lot of work involved. And finding people who have the expertise in bringing these stories to life, in meeting consumers customers, audience members, whatever you want to call them, who come to us. Some come with a lot of preconceived notions. They've read, like the bookshelves behind me here that you can see on screen, Matt, the dozens of feet of books in their library about Frank Lloyd Wright. How do we tell them something new? How do we give them an opportunity to see something differently? And then for the novice who's frankly might be dragged along by a spouse who's a Wright enthusiast, but they're not, how do we make it rich for them? And we have to do that all at the same time, right? There's people who are on tours together. How do we do that? So learning how to meet the audience, how to shape the impact that you have on these different audience members simultaneously, that's a real challenge. And again, I've been able to bring in some really extraordinarily skilled people, gifted people who do this so well. And I get to be their student and learn from them. And that's just a delight.
Stuart, I want you to just imagine that the listeners to this podcast are all kinds of community leaders. They're elected officials, they're appointed, they're staff people at cities and towns, they're nonprofit leaders like you are in their respective communities, all people dedicated to kind of bettering their community in some way. How do you relate the principles of organic architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright's philosophy, to what leaders of cities and towns should be thinking about for the betterment of their communities?
Well, I'm going to look at organic architecture in a couple of different ways as I respond to your question. First is the one I mentioned earlier, meeting the contemporary moment, meeting the needs of the people who are going to inhabit a building or a city or whatever it is that you're designing, right? And doing so in harmony with the world around you. So if you think about that as a leader, that's your job no matter what you're doing. You are looking at meeting the needs of whoever it is that you're trying to serve, really fulfilling their needs and doing so in a way that also takes the world around that group who you're serving and does it in harmony with them. That's one way of looking at it. But here's another way of looking at it. And I'm going to get to what I think of as the root of organic architecture, which is what you mentioned earlier in the quote that you read from Wright, which is democracy. Democracy is at the heart of organic architecture because democracy recognizes, in Wright's language, the aristocracy of the individual. It says that each person has the opportunity to realize their full potential. But at the same time, it's done in balance with the world around that individual. So it's not a case where only your needs matter. That's not the kind of individualism that Wright or the person that he was responding to, Emerson, was speaking of in Emerson's essay on self-reliance. That's not it at all. It's about giving you the resources to self-actualize, creating the space for you to explore your potential, and then harnessing that fully self-actualized individual, along with every other self-actualized individual, to achieve a common good. That's the balance. That's the harmonizing. That's living as part of the world and not merely in it or on it. And that's what Wright tried to do with buildings, but just as importantly, that's what Wright tried to do with ideas. And we often think of Wright only as an architect of buildings. But in fact, there are hundreds of thousands of pages of writing. He's in some ways as much of a philosopher as he is of an architect. And I think of his architecture as this architecture of ideas about connection with each other, connection with the world around us. And buildings and planning and design thinking help us achieve those connections in meaningful, nourishing, sustainable ways.
I want to build on what you just said about Frank Lloyd Wright, architecture as a demonstration of democratic ideals. It's also true that Frank Lloyd Wright, when asked about religion, he said that nature was his religion and put a capital N on nature. Can you talk a little bit about the implications of drawing from the natural environment for his architecture as well?
Sure. I often think of Wright as envisioning something as a precursor to ecosystem thinking, right? In nature, there's a few characteristics that are always true. Nature abhors monoculture. Monoculture, when you only grow, say, one kind of crop in a field, it strips the nutrients from the field. You constantly have to add and supplement. Otherwise, it just dies. So nature likes to create diverse ecosystems and the fewer resources that are naturally available, as in places like the Daintree Forest in Australia, when there are scarce natural resources, you have a more diverse ecosystem because a more diverse ecosystem is more resilient. In nature, things help each other out. Think back to grade school. Remember learning about the three sisters, the Native American approach to planting, where you had squash, you had beans, and you had corn. And these things, because they consume and contribute different nutrients to the ecosystem, they all help each other out. So they grow together very well. They grow together better than they grow separately. And it's that same ecosystem approach that one takes care of another, that we work together to achieve something greater than we can achieve on our own. This is the rudiments of democratic society. And it has its analog in the natural world, and Wright respected that. And that's why he wanted an architecture that would work the way that nature worked. It would work in harmony with what's around us instead of competing and holding resources to the exclusion of other parts of the systems around it. He often said that a building should grace the landscape rather than disgrace the landscape. And he even goes so far in a great interview with Mike Wallace to tie that to, as he says, an architecture worthy of the Declaration of Independence. It's the center line of our freedom. Because I think for Wright, he believed that we don't have freedom if we're not in balance with each other, if we're not working to help each other, if some of us are literally or metaphorically slaves to others. That's not a democracy. He loves democracy. He wants the same democracy that exists in the natural world, where all things get celebrated because all things contribute.
Well, don't governments grow out of people, Mr. Wright?
It should, but it doesn't. It hasn't in Russia, and it hasn't here, particularly lately. It doesn't grow out of the people's knowledge of what's good for them, of what is the nature of the thing they're in. They're without the intelligence Thomas Jefferson thought would be ours in a democracy. We haven't manifested it. We can see now mediocrity rising into high places. We can see how Jefferson's unwillingness to qualify the vote has resulted in this mediocrity rising into high places.
But we're responsible, aren't we?
We are responsible ourselves, but we don't wake up to the responsibility. We don't take it. Where do you know a group of men or women who are consciously aware, politically, we'll say, of the principles which were declared by the Declaration of Independence and the responsibility for the development of a conscience that it places upon them? You don't find it very rare. It doesn't manifest in the street. It doesn't manifest in the movies. It doesn't manifest sometimes in the theater. We see a little of it.
Well, then, in the days that have gone by since our Declaration of Independence, we've gone to the Dickens in a handbasket, but somebody has been responsible, and evidently the people have to be responsible. When I say the people, the mob, whomever, people don't arrive at being president or senator or mayor unless they are elected.
It's perfectly true that there will be no turn for the better until the people awaken to the nature of the thing that has them in thrall. But this matter is not a matter for a tinker. It's a matter of something that must be grown. And I don't see it growing as Thomas Jefferson thought it would grow, by education. I think education has been lax in all this thing. I believe we haven't gone to school to learn about ourselves. We haven't gone to school to learn the nature of things. And until nature study is the basis of our education, we will continue to be in danger of communism, of all the isms and deistics and deites you can name.
Frank Lloyd Wright says that Thomas Jefferson and perhaps the rest of the founding fathers put a lot of expectation that education was going to raise the citizenry up. But he's disappointed by that. He thinks that education hasn't quite done that. And I think that's where he comes to say, and this is why individualism is so important. This is why leadership is so important in communities. Am I interpreting that right, the way you think about it?
Yeah, I think you are. There's that. Growing up, I remember hearing this cute little couplet from Thomas Jefferson around the importance of education and why the Library of Congress was created. He who wishes to remain ignorant and free wants what never was and never will be, is the couplet. And I think that's what you hear Wright speaking to, is that democratic society begins with the idea of individuals taking responsibility for themselves. This is something that we sometimes, I think, have lost today. We talk about rights and we don't necessarily talk about responsibilities. Yet without responsibilities, you have no rights. That's a given, I think, for any student of free society. That said, how do you learn to fulfill your responsibilities and to do that well? Well, you learn that through an education. And for Wright, he speaks of that education as being premised in nature. We're learning a lot about plants, but let's go back to his time. Plants are making their own way in the world. They grow wild. They don't come with an education. They have to find their way. They find their way through the elements. They find their way through struggles. They grow and evolve over time and over generations. And so too do people in society. When Wright speaks to nature, he also uses the word nature not just to describe plants and squirrels and birds and things, but he's also talking about nature as the intrinsic character of things, that it has to be in our nature to learn, to grow, to take on responsibility, and not to passively accept the world we live in, to be bystanders, not only in our lives, but in our country, in our society. But rather, we have to take an active role in shaping the society that we want it to be. And those two things, the education about the world around us, about the people around us, about social development and history and all those things, coupled with that decision to take responsibility for ourselves and the world around us, I think Wright sees those two things coming together as the way to build a resilient and highly functioning society that helps the people within it. That when we don't have both of those things happening, both the education about the world, but also the willingness to take on responsibility to sustain ourselves and each other, that he sees as the failure of democracy and the descent into what he would refer to as the mobocracy. Because in the mobocracy, and you hear him at the end of that clip speaking about communism, one of the things he really loathes about communism, and he did find much to admire in his visits in the Soviet Union. It was not a place that had no redeeming qualities, but he did not appreciate at all. He rejected entirely the idea that the state will do your thinking for you. The state will make your decisions for you. I think that's as repugnant a thought to Wright as to any highly functioning person, that someone gets to decide for you. And yet he sees in America people deciding this should be your entertainment, this should be how you live, this should be what you do, instead of people deciding that for themselves. We see that all around us today, and I think Wright would have a decidedly negative opinion of whether it's large companies with their algorithms on social media or whether it's news media or whoever else, people making up your mind for you. Educate yourself. Take on the responsibility to make up your own mind about things. That's what he's looking for.
Stuart, before I let you go, I want to ask you a series of lightning round questions, if I may. These are quick response off the top of your head. You ready?
We'll give it a try.
Stuart Graff, how would you describe your leadership style in 3 words?
Trying to do better. Sorry, that was 4.
That's okay. How would you describe Frank Lloyd Wright's leadership style in 3 words?
Always learning, growing.
Stuart, what's the most impactful leadership advice you've ever received?
We have to act with humility and rely on the forgiveness of others if we're going to try to achieve anything in this world.
And I'm picturing you walking around Taliesin West, where Frank Lloyd Wright lived and worked for so many years. What piece of advice do you imagine the spirit of Frank Lloyd Wright is most often telling you?
Pay attention to the world around you. It's not going to fail you, but take care of it.
Stuart, if you were going to send a message to yourself back in time to 2016, just before accepting your position as president and CEO of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, what would you say?
There's always going to be an opportunity to to make a difference in this role that I'm in. Abandon your preconceived notions of how you're going to do that, because the opportunities to make a difference are going to present themselves to you, and you need to meet them without your preset agenda.
What is a myth about Frank Lloyd Wright that you wish you could dispel once and for all?
That his vanity, as seen in so many interviews, was his character. In fact, he is an incredibly humble man. He uses that vanity to present himself as an authority. That's what he felt he needed to do, and others too in that period of time.
Stuart Graff, what's your favorite Frank Lloyd Wright structure?
Oh, the one I'm about to see, always. I don't really have one. Each one meets its circumstance. Each one is filled with a story, and I love stories. Stories are what we're hardwired to use to mediate our way through the world. And each one has a story of an owner, a story of a community, a story of a moment in time. And how can you not be drawn into all those wonderful, profoundly human stories?
I usually ask the same question at the end of every interview, but I'm going to expand it a little bit for you. I usually ask what gives you hope for the future, but you are the leader of an organization that Frank Lloyd Wright created himself that was future focused. So let me ask you the question jointly. What gives you and what gives Frank Lloyd Wright hope for the future?
Well, it's like I said, one of the things that he said about himself, and I got to quote this. There is an architect here in Scottsdale. He was an apprentice to Frank Lloyd Wright back in the 50s, named Vern Swaback. And Vern likes to tell this story. So Vern, I think, was 17 years old, and Wright was 90 years old when the story takes place. I'm going to adopt Vern's voice for this. So I'm out there talking with Mr. Wright, and Wright says, "Vern, you know what I like about myself?" Then you're going to pause and think to yourself, oh, here comes one of those Frank Lloyd Wright-isms, right? His very quotable quotes that he has. But before Vern can finish that thought, Wright continues on. He said, even at my age, I can still learn new things. And that's what I think gave Wright hope, that he was open to change. He was open to improving. He was open to the experience that the world offers. And that's what gives me hope, is whatever course we're on, doesn't matter what it is, we can change it. It's in our power if we inform ourselves, if we take on the responsibility to change it, we take on the responsibility to nurture and nourish the change so it becomes the change we want to see in the world. We can do it. And the only thing that keeps us from that is ourselves.
Stuart Graff, thank you for being open to this conversation, and congratulations on your tenure. Congratulations on all the important and wonderful work of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Thanks, Matt. A pleasure always to talk with you too.
Once again, my thanks to Stuart Graff, President and CEO of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. And if you ever visit Scottsdale or find yourself in the Phoenix area, you absolutely must take a tour of Taliesin West. I've put a link in the program notes. This episode was produced by Kerry Lengel and edited by Nick Living the Dream Tantillo. Jenna Maisel is our production assistant. Our executive producer is John Little. I'm Matt Lehrman of Social Prosperity Partners. If you have a question, comment, or story to share, reach me at 602-688-2724 or podcast at socialprosperity.us. I'd love to hear from you. We'll be back soon with another Community Catalyst.